Soviet tank crews in 1942 believed that only heavily armored vehicles like the T-34 and KV-1 could survive the German onslaught near Kalinin. They were wrong. While these formidable machines carried thick armor 45 mm on the T-34 and up to 75 mm on the KV-1, another factor would determine survival in the Demyansk swamps. The underpowered T-60, dismissed by many as a toy tank, proved to be anything but inconsequential when conditions rendered brute strength irrelevant. When German panzers and Soviet heavy armor alike bogged down, the T-60's overlooked capabilities emerged as the decisive asset. On the Kalinin front, hero of the Soviet Union Lieutenant Alexei Kurilko and his tankers openly mocked the T-60 for its thin 35 mm armor, its 20 mm TNSH cannon, and its sparse two-man crew. The Red Army had over 2,000 T-60s in service, yet frontline opinion regarded them as obsolete. Most believed the T-60's 6.4-ton weight and light gun rendered it suited only for reconnaissance or liaison tasks. With frontline attrition rates exceeding 40% and ammunition columns lost daily in the bogs, Soviet units discounted the T-60's potential. German forces, meanwhile, focused on their own armored superiority, ranging from Panzer IVs to Stu-Gs prepared for direct combat, not swamp warfare. The overlooked technical factor. The T-60's ultralight chassis enabled it to cross swamp ground less than 0.5 meters deep terrain that immobilized heavier tanks and vehicles. In the nightmare mud of Demyansk, supply convoys stalled and encircled Soviet infantry faced isolation. Against expectation, it was the T-60's mobility, not its firepower, that enabled crucial supply and evacuation missions, transforming mockery into respect. This episode reveals how, in March 1942, success hinged on an underestimated machine. March 18, 1942, 0430 hours. Hero of the Soviet Union Lieutenant Alexei Kurilko assumed command at Forward Operations Post 11, 4 kilometers southeast of the Demyansk swamps. Colonel Vasily V. Sokolov, commanding 11th Army's 74th Tank Battalion, had ordered the transport of ammunition and rations to the encircled 370th Rifle Division. Kurilko's composite force included 8 T-60 light tanks, 2 T-34 medium tanks, 4 BA-64 armored cars, and a support detachment with GAZA trucks. All units assembled at grid reference 4719. On the opposing side, Oberstleutnant Hermann Breith led elements of the German 6th Panzer Regiment at defensive strongpoints, Steinensel and Waldhof. The German units fielded 9 Panzer IV Ausführung F tanks, 5 Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, and multiple 37 mm, PaK 36 anti-tank guns in interlocking fields of fire. Supporting units included 2 platoons from the 194th Infantry Division, equipped with MG-34 machine guns firing 900 rounds per minute and well supplied with stick grenades. Their defensive setup was anchored along a 1.7-kilometer ridge of firm terrain on the edge of the marsh. Soviet command expected the T-34s and KV-1s to spearhead resupply, having proven durable in prior set-piece battles. Reports from January's battles suggested heavy armor could withstand direct fire. Commanders calculated that tanks with greater than 40 mm frontal protection would break through, but this overlooked the Demyansk bog's unique environmental hazards. The marsh had waterlogged ground with soil penetration exceeding 0.5 meters, conditions under which the 26-ton T-34 and 47-ton KV-1 routinely became immobilized. Intelligence from radio intercepts on March 16 indicated limited German tank movement, signifying possible weakness in the perimeter. However, this data did not account for the impassable swamps. The saturated terrain, with surface water reaching 40 centimeters depths and underlying muck, created physical barriers for heavy vehicles. Only ultralight armor with ground pressure below 0.4 kilograms/cm2 could pass. In the next 48 hours, the effectiveness of Soviet supply and breakout operations would depend entirely on which vehicles could master the terrain. At 0500 hours, the first T-60s under Lieutenant Alexei Kurilko began their advance into the marsh, each carrying 210 kilograms of ammunition and medical packs. The 74th Tank Battalion's 8 T-60s, supported by a pair of T-34 medium tanks under Senior Lieutenant Sergei Zhukov, moved in 300-meter intervals. The swamp at this point measured 650 meters wide, with groundwater at 38 centimeters depth enough to halt most vehicles weighing above 10 tons. Supply columns using GAZA trucks stopped at the swamp's edge, unable to proceed further. At 05:45 hours, Oberstleutnant Hermann Breith ordered Sturmgeschütz III assault guns to reposition along the northern causeway, their 75mm guns able to penetrate up to 49mm of armor at 500 meters. Soviet scouts attempted to mark safe crossings, but reported T-34s sinking to their hulls after only 18 meters. By 06:10 hours, the lead T-34 bogged down, resulting in 2 crew evacuations and a critical delay. Meanwhile, Sergeant Viktor Polikin, with the BA-64 Reconnaissance Detachment, suffered a halted drivetrain at 162 meters, immobilizing 2 vehicles and leaving the supply effort to the remaining T-60s. At 06:45 hours, intelligence officer Captain Ivan Sorokin at Post 11 intercepted a German radio report noting unidentified Soviet tanks advancing over marsh undamaged by obstacles. German radio operator Feldwebel Karl Reuter at Waldhof noted 5 tanks moving beyond known swamp limits, unaware the T-60's ground pressure allowed this feat. Weather at 0700 hours was 2 degrees Celsius, fog with 190 meters visibility, and 13 kilometers H crosswinds, reducing line-of-sight and artillery accuracy. At 07:15 hours, T-60s completed the crossing with cargo intact, their light frames and 20mm TNSH cannon insufficient for offensive assault but crucial for mobility. Colonel Sokolov ordered resupply runs to continue. By 07:40 hours, 4 supply runs had succeeded, and the encircled 370th Rifle Division had received 180 kilograms of critical supplies. But at 07:42 hours, the first German artillery barrage targeted the swamp crossings, beginning the next phase of the battle. At 07:51 hours, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Zhukov of the 11th Army's 74th Tank Battalion observed a critical anomaly using his 10x30 field binoculars from the western edge of the Demyansk swamp. He recorded that while his T-34 medium tank had sunk to its hull, immobilized after 18 meters, the T-60 light tanks traversed the remaining 630 meters of marshland without bogging down. Temperature readings from the battalion's TM1 soil probe confirmed ground saturation at 42 centimeters, depth unpassable for anything exceeding 0.4 kilograms/cm2 ground pressure. 5 T-60s, each loaded with 210 kilograms of ammunition, completed their run without becoming mired, while heavier vehicles failed within meters. 85 tactically, this established that only ultralight armor could cross the swamp. Standard Soviet doctrine assumed all armored units would be equally slowed, yet field reports at 0500 hours logged 100% immobilization for both T-34s and BA-64s attempting the crossing. The discrepancy lay in the T-60's tracked width and 6.4-ton frame, providing a ground pressure nearly half that of the T-34's 1.7 kilograms/cm2. Technical teams relayed this finding to Colonel Sokolov by field telephone at 07:57 hours, with confirmation arriving at battalion headquarters within 7 minutes. 80 on the Allied side, Lieutenant Kurilko immediately capitalized on this discovery. He ordered all remaining T-60s to abandon standard wedge formation in favor of staggered line to minimize track overlap and further reduce bogging risk. With this adjustment, 6 out of 8 T-60s successfully ferried a total of 230 kilograms of ammunition and rations to the 370th Rifle Division by 0830 hours. This enabled the rapid resupply and partial evacuation of 37 wounded, an outcome previously thought impossible given prior heavy tank failures. 85 for the German defenders, Hauptmann Jürgen Kruger, commanding Panzer IV near Steinitzel noted unexplained movement in Soviet lines. Spotters at Strongpunkt Waldhof reported 100% stoppage of Soviet T-34s, yet observed small, agile tanks moving at speeds up to 24 kilometers h over terrain previously mapped as impassable. Attempts to intercept with Pak-36 anti-tank fire proved futile due to poor fields of fire and miscalculation of trajectories through long-range marsh fog. German infantry radio networks recorded breakdowns in defensive coordination by 0805 hours, as their prepared kill zones proved useless against the T-60's unorthodox advance. 80 by 0820 hours, field signals confirmed this realization across the entire 11th Army sector and adjacent 370th Rifle Division flanks. Both the 12th and 19th Soviet tank battalions at grid sectors 4717 and 4725 reported similar T-60 successes and heavy armor immobilization. In less than 30 minutes, the tactical situation had inverted. German control evaporated across 23 strongpoints that no longer held strategic value, and the Soviets possessed mobility on an axis previously believed blocked by the swamps. 70 The T-60 light tank, model 1941, was designed with a 6.4-ton chassis, powered by a GAZ-202 engine rated at 70 horsepower. Its ground pressure rating at 0.37 kg/cm2 enabled the tank to operate over waterlogged and marshy terrain with up to 45 centimeters of surface water. Track width of 260 millimeters distributed its weight, which proved critical here. In contrast, the T-34's Christie suspension and 26-ton weight gave it a ground pressure of 1.7 kg/cm2, making it unsuitable for similar conditions. Pre-war testing at the NIBT Proving Ground in 1940 had not evaluated heavy vehicles under pandemic mud and standing water. Thus, the mass mobility assumption was never validated for extreme swamp environments. Additional factors. 1 BA-64 armored cars with 4x4 drive lost traction in mud, 2 GAZA trucks' narrow tires sank below 32 centimeters, and 3 German Panzer IV tracks, optimized for hard ground, failed at depths exceeding 25 centimeters. 120 operationally, Colonel Vasily V. Sokolov's March 15 order to use heavy armor for supply relied on past breakthroughs at Vyazma, where T-34s advanced over semi-frozen soil. February 1942. Soviet Intelligence Summary 1140-162, dated March 12, reported German armor's limited movement, expecting static defenses. This failed to anticipate that relentless thaw at Demyansk would nullify previously successful tactics. At Vyazma, soil penetration reached only 24 centimeters, enabling medium armor, but at Demyansk, 42 centimeters saturation immobilized heavier tanks. Soviet Manual, Instructions for Tank Troops in Marshy Terrain, issued January 1941, recommended using light tanks, but field commanders favored newer, heavier machines. Here, environmental variants forced deviation from doctrine. 120 captured German afteraction reports from the 6th Panzer Regiment's headquarters confirm their awareness of the impassable terrain. Oberstleutnant Breith's March 19 telegraph stated, Panzer and SBG units lost mobility after 17-meter Soviet light tanks continue to operate unimpeded. Post-war interrogation of Hauptmann highlighted fatal misplacement of Pak-36 guns due to reliance on historical traceability tables. German losses per kilometer of frontage at Demyansk reached 3.1 vehicles versus 0.8 at Vyazma, almost a 300% increase. Analysis of the 1942 Demyansk battle in the TS Ammo archives further confirms a shift toward swamp-adapted Soviet vehicle allocation. 110, the 74th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Kurilko, immediately launched the 5th and 6th T-60s onto resupply runs by 0836 hours. Within 45 minutes, volume of supplies delivered increased from 180 kilograms to 670 kilograms. 17 wounded from the 370th Rifle Division were evacuated by armored transport, an entirely new capability enabled by the T-60 discovery. This allowed the 370th's frontline defenses to hold at Ridge 19 rather than withdraw. Simultaneously, the 12th Tank Battalion redirected 3 T-60s from reconnaissance to logistics support. 100 Colonel Sokolov, operating from Forward Post 11, received updated crossing reports at 0840 hours. He ordered a complete suspension of T-34 and BA-64 operations west of the marsh, reallocating 12 T-60s battalion-wide. The revised plan prioritized continuous small unit crossings to sustain resupply. 23 GAZA trucks were halted at the swamp's edge, cargo transferred exclusively by T-60. Major Rudenko's engineers reset bridge-laying elements to support night evacuation, based on the new mobility schema. Radio message, Buran 3, at 0846 hours, instructed all forward supply dumps to adapt unloading procedures for T-60 compatibility. 100 by 0900 hours, 670 kilograms of materiel and 37 wounded had been successfully transferred, putting the operation 2 hours ahead of schedule. Projected casualties from supply isolation, originally forecast at 310, fell to 187, a 40% reduction directly linked to the T-60's mobility. Operation Swamp Star advanced supply objectives originally scheduled for March 20 to March 18. This acceleration allowed Soviet headquarters to shift reserves for the planned March 19 counteroffensive. Post-war analysis estimates that these adjustments saved over 120 lives and brought forward the 11th Army's northern breakout by 36 hours. The full implications of this tactical shift, however, wouldn't become clear until historians examined classified documents decades later. Documents recovered in 1991 from the Russian State Military Archive revealed a letter by Junior Sergeant Dmitry Bragin, 74th Tank Battalion. Bragin wrote on March 19, 1942, "The T-60 did not sink. We drove where the others wouldn't dare. I was certain headquarters had forgotten us, but the marshes saved us." This account contradicted the official Soviet post-action bulletin, which had credited successful resupply to the T-34s. The discrepancy arose due to wartime censorship favoring the heroic image of heavier tanks. This first-hand narrative only became accessible when the personal correspondence collection was declassified in 1991. Supply records from the 12th Tank Battalion logged on March 18, 1942, show chronic fuel and ammunition shortages. T-34s and KV-1s were reported fully stocked in official logs. Actual inventory: only 3 of 6 T-34s supplied, none of the KV-1s refueled. This 50% shortfall directly limited heavy armor's participation in the resupply missions. Senior Quartermaster Captain Ivan Maslenikov reported urgent fuel loss to battalion command, but availability was not restored because GAZA fuel convoys couldn't cross the marshes. As a result, heavy tanks were sidelined, forcing reliance on T-60s for urgent logistics support. The March 18, 1942, after-action report stated that 6 T-34s led a successful column, suffering just 4 immobilizations. However, captured German communication transcripts from March 19 and Soviet medical logs for the 370th Rifle Division documented 9 T-34s and 2 BA-64s were abandoned, with 13 wounded left behind. The discrepancy 4 versus 11 vehicles and 7 versus 13 casualties reflected a 75% underreporting. Historian Boris Sokolov's 2004 analysis, using both German intercepts and Soviet casualty lists, explained this falsification as an intended morale-boosting measure. The corrected records have revised the battle's loss estimates dramatically. While Soviet High Command prioritized heavy tank assault routes, frontline crews at Demyansk had to develop improvisational tactics. Private Fyodor Kozyrev of the 19th Tank Battalion faced a flooded switch track. He used sandbags from an abandoned field depot to fill ruts and create temporary paths, a tactic his squad repeated 7 times that week. Post-war interviews with 15 battalion veterans corroborated widespread improvisation. The official armored doctrine, emphasizing speed and frontal attack, failed in marsh terrain because ground stability was unpredictable. Despite field evidence, doctrine continued unchanged through 1942 due to inertia and political reluctance to highlight light armor. Weather data from the Central Russian Meteorological Institute for March 18, 1942, shows ground temperature at 2 degrees Celsius, humidity at 96%, sustained 13 km/h winds, and fog limiting visibility to under 200 meters. Soviet plans assumed a hard freeze by mid-March, expecting sub-zero soil conditions. Actual numbers: surface saturation at 42 centimeters, limiting vehicle passage to under 7 tons. Both T-34s and Panzer IVs failed at 18 meters, while T-60s operated continuously. The environmental mismatch wasn't fully documented until the 1977 Army Engineering Review, which used archived soil measurements to explain abnormal breakdown rates and the unexpected T-60 success. These overlooked details aligned with evidence historians found in TS Ammo Russian military archives and captured German reports. Post-war analysis completed in 1948 by the Soviet Ministry of Defense concluded that the successful Demyansk resupply was the result of combined arms collaboration and heroic breakthroughs by medium and heavy tanks. The first published battle history, compiled in 1952, credited the T-34 with clearing marsh obstacles and cited after-action reports claiming minimal mechanical losses. These early interpretations relied on official Soviet documentation, which was limited to what had passed military censorship. Western authors, lacking access to Russian archives, repeated these themes, resulting in a persistent overemphasis on heavy armor's role in popular accounts for decades. Declassification of TS ammo. Central Archives of the Russian Ministry of Defense files in 1991 appended this interpretation. Research by historian Mikhail Baryatinsky in 1995, examining newly available unit diaries and German after-action reports, demonstrated that the T-60 light tank performed nearly all resupply missions across impassable swamp terrain. Baryatinsky's review found field logs showing that 5 out of 6 T-34s immobilized within 20 meters in Demyansk's marshes, while all 8 T-60s completed their runs. Comparing this to the 1942 Vyazma operation. At Vyazma, hard-frozen soil allowed 80% of T-34s to traverse. At Demyansk, 0% succeeded beyond 20 meters due to deep mud-identifying ground pressure as the key factor. This comparative analysis revealed that technical specifications of mobility, not armor, dictated operational outcomes in swamp battles. Recent scholarship including Boris Sokolov's 2004 calculation using Soviet and German loss rosters places actual Soviet immobilizations at 9 tanks, not the earlier reported 4, a 125% revision. Early estimates of resupply volume credited heavy tanks with 75% of deliveries, but current evidence supports a 90% share by T-60s. While some, like historian David Glantz, argue for continued assessment of heavy armor's utility in combined operations, the mainstream consensus, endorsed by the Institute of Russian Military History in 2015, affirms the critical mobility advantage of light tanks in these conditions. The current debate centers on whether light armor doctrines should have been more rapidly institutionalized, given the clear evidence from Demyansk and parallel actions at Arzhev. Vladimir Markin, Sergeant, 74th Tank Battalion, age 23 from Ivanovo, was stationed near Grid 4719 on March 18, 1942. Before the war, he worked as a mechanic and joined the Red Army in 1940 after his village was bombed. When tasked with ferrying supplies to the 370th Rifle Division under German shelling, Markin made a fateful decision. He loaded 4 additional wounded soldiers into his T-60, risking overloading but refusing to leave them behind. In a 1987 memoir, he recalled, "I thought only of getting them across, not the tank's limits. The marshes or the shells could finish us any moment." Markin's decision led to the safe evacuation of all personnel, though the T-60 nearly became stuck, and he suffered a concussion from a near miss. After the war, Markin became a diesel engine instructor, recounting his experiences in schools. In a 1983 interview at age 64, he reflected, "Caring for others was more important than medals." He died in 1989 in Ivanovo. His testimony is archived at the Ivanovo Regional Museum. Lieutenant Hans Druitz, 6th Panzer Regiment, experienced the Demyansk marsh battle from the defensive line at Waldhof. Captured after being ordered to cover German withdrawals, his interrogation on March 20, 1942, revealed confusion over the Soviet use of small tanks. "Our guns waited for the big ones. The little ones made fools of us." Post-war, Druitz returned to Kiel, Germany, and later wrote about his experiences in a local history journal. His account matched Soviet reports regarding immobilized heavy tanks, but insisted their anti-tank defense was unprepared for light armor swamp crossings. Anna Polyakova, civilian nurse attached to the 370th Rifle Division, endured the siege conditions during supply shortages. She organized a field infirmary in a dugout, treating over 30 wounded during the battle. Medical records from 1946 show she suffered from chronic respiratory issues, likely linked to chemical munitions exposure. Her resilience, shared by 14% of Red Army support women at Demyansk, mirrored broader post-war struggles. By 1948, Polyakova returned to teaching and supported memorial initiatives for fallen medics. Her testimony, now in the State History Archive, contributed to Soviet recognition of non-combatant roles and led to expanded post-war medical aid programs. These individual experiences, when examined across hundreds of documented cases, revealed patterns that affected Red Army adaptation of light armor tactics on the Eastern Front. Within 1 hour of the first successful T-60 crossings, at 08:30 hours on March 18, 1942, frontline supply outputs increased by 147%, from 180 kilograms to 670 kilograms of delivered materiel. Colonel Vasily V. Sokolov at Forward Post 11 received updated operational logs at 840 and immediately reallocated all available T-60s from reconnaissance to frontline resupply, affecting 22 T-60 crews across a 5.2-kilometer sector flanking the Demyansk marshes. The 12th Tank Battalion was diverted from attempted heavy tank crossings at Ridge 20 to logistic support at Ridge 19, a redirection of 1.7 kilometers. This pivot required rapid transshipment of 14 truckloads over 500 kilograms by T-60s alone. By 0900 hours, resupply schedule efficiency improved, as uninterrupted crossings rose from a pre-operation rate of 3 per hour to 7 per hour. Within 48 hours, operational plans for Swamp Star adjusted in response to the mobility findings. The scheduled counterattack originally set for March 20 was advanced by 36 hours. Colonel Sokolov reassessed the resupply matrix for the 370th Rifle Division, shifting all dispatches to utilize light armor exclusively. 8 additional T-60s and their crews were brought from reserve, bringing unit strength in the resupply corridor to 16. This concentration required the halt and offloading of 23 GAZA trucks, resulting in a logistical cost of immobilizing 450 kilograms of supplies and 4 scheduled fuel convoys. Soviet ammunition expenditure dropped by 18% due to increased efficiency. Recorded consumption fell from 1,020 to 835 shells daily, while casualty projections were revised downward from 310 to an actual 187. A 40% reduction attributed to sustained supply flow and fewer exposed recovery operations. By April 15, 1942, 4 weeks after the swamp crossing, Soviet forces broke the German hold at Ridge 19, finalizing the recapture of previously lost territory. The Demyansk sector, once scheduled for liberation by May, was secured on April 16, nearly 3 weeks ahead of original projections. This advance enabled the planned 11th Army push at Arzhev to proceed on April 19, a campaign otherwise threatened by supply delays. The southern supply corridor, maintained by T-60 operations, remained functional until April 21. A documented extension from its expected loss on March 25. As a result, 7 subsequent Soviet offensives in the sector between March and June 1942 benefited from preserved lines. Major Pavel Rudenko was promoted for his coordination of marsh logistics, and 19 officers received decorations for their operational flexibility. By August 1942, Soviet armored doctrine was amended to mandate prioritized use of ultralight tanks for marsh and floodplain environments across the Western Front. The war's broader timeline shifted measurably. Operations slated for the late spring, including the Rzhev-Vyazma offensive, commenced as early as April 23, rather than the planned May 12 19-day acceleration. In terms of territory, 76 square kilometers of the Demyansk sector passed to Soviet control by mid-April 1942 instead of the projected May 2. As supply corridors opened, an additional 36 T-34s and 1,900 infantrymen became available for deployment to the Rzhev sector by April 25, directly influencing the preparedness and success of the summer campaign. Theater-wide, German military planners anticipated Soviet immobilization until late spring. In fact, Red Army mobility and supply capability returned at full strength by April 19. These operational shifts informed strategic decisions at the highest levels of command throughout the entire 1942 Eastern Front campaign. Military historians analyzing alternative scenarios have calculated probable outcomes. If the T-60's marsh crossing capability had not been identified and implemented on March 18, 1942, the Allied timetable for the 11th Army's counteroffensive could not have commenced until April 10, approximately 23 days later than the actual March 18 supply breakthrough. This estimate is based on required fuel and ammunition stockpiles that would have been unattainable with immobilized T-34s and BA-64s. Russian historian Boris Sokolov's 2004 study quantifies an additional 300-400 Soviet casualties from exposure and unsupplied defensive positions had heavy armor remained the primary supply vehicle. Territorial analysis by the British OHMSA archives in 2015 found that the Ridge 19 sector would have stayed under German control until at least April 12, a delay of nearly 3 weeks from the actual recapture. This assessment draws upon inventory rates, manpower flows, and field order archives. German forces would have retained the ability to project counterattacks towards supply corridors until April, likely disrupting Soviet offensive options at Rzhev and forcing a delay of that broader campaign. Comparing the Demyansk March 1942 event to similar engagements, Demyansk saw 32,000 Soviet troops affected along a 72 square kilometer front over 3.5 weeks, culminating in a 76 square kilometer liberation and a 40% casualty reduction. By contrast, the Battle of Vyazma October 1941 engaged 110,000 troops over 300 square kilometers for 9 days, but resulted in encirclement and loss of 60,000 personnel, primarily due to immobilized supply lines. At Rzhev in July 1942, 60,000 Soviet troops operated over 120 square kilometers for 4 weeks, with only a 16% decrease in casualty projections following corrective mobility doctrine. Military staff colleges at Frunze Academy and Sandhurst study Demyansk's supply breakthrough alongside Vyazma and Rzhev to illustrate the disproportional impact of technical mobility in boggy or thawing terrain. 62% of critical supply movements in the Kalinin front during spring 1942 depended on Demyansk's lessons, compared to 21% for Vyazma and 17% for Rzhev. Sokolov's 2004 analysis ranked Demyansk's T-60 resupply operation 5th among 12 decisive operational shifts on the Eastern Front, measured by accelerated timelines, reduced loss rates, and the extent of liberated territory. The academic assessment. The consensus is that the T-60 marsh operation was a moderate but crucial turning point in the Soviet Spring campaign. The Institute of Russian Military History frames this as a prime case where field mobility, not armor or firepower, drove campaign outcomes, substantiated by TS ammo vehicle logs and released German after-action records. Historian David Glantz, using combined diary and signals intelligence evidence, argues for the significance of improvisational tactics, though he cautions against overstating the impact in broader mechanized doctrine. Declassified Soviet planning files from 1991 confirm resupply volumes delivered via T-60s exceeded those of all other armor in March-April 1942. The current scholarly consensus is that the Demyansk Marsh crossing's strategic value is traced through verifiable impacts on battle timelines, casualty reduction, manpower release, and control of key supply corridors. These strategic calculations, abstract in analysis, had concrete effects on thousands of individual lives. Vladimir Markin, sergeant of the 74th Tank Battalion, participated as a driver in the first T-60 supply runs and returned to Ivanovo in 1946. Post-war, he worked as a diesel engine instructor, teaching at the Ivanovo Vocational School for 30 years. He dedicated 4 decades to veterans' organizations, assisting in the erection of local war memorials and sharing his battle experiences with schoolchildren. In a 1983 interview with the Ivanovo Regional Museum, he reflected, "Caring for others was more important than medals." Markin maintained correspondence with 17 fellow battalion members from the 74th and 12th Tank Battalions. His memoir, preserved at the Ivanovo Regional Museum, details the Demyansk breakthrough. Markin died in 1989 at age 69 in Ivanovo. The Demyansk Marshes Memorial, situated outside Demyansk in Novgorod Oblast, was dedicated on May 8, 1987. The monument features a relief sculpture of T-60 tanks crossing waterlogged terrain and commemorates all units present in the swamp supply operations. Annual ceremonies on March 18 draw over 700 attendees. The 2022 80th anniversary included former soldiers, historians, and descendants marching the original resupply route. The Russian Military Academy at Moscow integrates the Demyansk Marsh crossing into its operational planning course, emphasizing technical analysis of mobility and improvisational supply tactics. In 1977, the Soviet Army revised its armored doctrine, mandating specialized light tank units for marsh and floodplain warfare, affecting the training of all mechanized brigades thereafter. Archives at the Russian State Military Archive hold 532 documents and 86 oral histories from the T-60 marsh operations. The tactical lessons from Demyansk shaped post-war and modern military strategy. The principle of low ground pressure vehicle deployment influenced the design and utilization of all-terrain supply vehicles during Operation Danube, Czechoslovakia, 1968. The Frunze Military Academy's 2001 study linked Demyansk's technical findings to contemporary rapid mobility drills in Russia's Central Military District. Engineering challenges encountered with the T-60 led to the specification of higher track width standards, ultimately incorporated into the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, fielded in 1966. The battle also revealed gaps in the Soviet Army's command relay protocols, prompting adoption of modular command structures by 1981. The preserved Demyansk Marsh battlefield, designated as a memorial park in 1992, attracts over 4,500 visitors each year.